I share my screen and just check that you can see that full screen?
Yes,
yes,
it's okay.
And you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. So, thank you again. Thank you to Nicola for setting out both some of the basic tenets of risk communication and also particularly from a journalistic perspective. So I'm a geoscientist, earthquake geologist by training, but as someone who's moved into popular communication and very much interested in science communication. And I'm going to take this perspective from the point of view of how do we better train our experts to start working in the kind of way that was mentioned by Nicola in various aspects. The WMO approach have been more people-centered in terms of what's expected for them. So this is outlines some of the work that I've been doing both under the auspices of the Tomorrow Cities Project, which is a UK-led but a global interdisciplinary research project looking at urban risk transitions, but also the work that I'm starting to do with the Royal Scientific Society here in Jordan. So let me introduce what I think is a challenge, and I'll outline in the first part the key challenges I think that we face within the DRR community. Everyone, I'm sure, knows the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015. But one of its key messages, underlying messages, is this notion that the risk management, disaster risk management, needs to be broader and more people-centered at tackling developing preventative attitudes towards disaster risk. And that means multi-hazard, that means multi-sectoral, being inclusive and accessible, in other words, to the actual, as was mentioned with the WMO, being accessible to those communities, those people that are actually going to be effective. And that's a kind of big cultural and mindset change for many risk specialists, the idea of how do you connect top-down, expert-driven risk management with the communities themselves. And this image really introduces where I've most recently been doing most of my work. This is Istanbul. This is one of the neighborhoods, earthquake-prone neighborhoods in Istanbul, whereby the old community neighborhoods have been ripped down because those buildings will not stand up to an earthquake, and modern apartments have been put in its place with the expectation that those will stay up in the next earthquake, even though there's now far more people living in those areas, those dangerous areas, than lived there before. And at the same time, there's been a erosion of the community spirit in that area as a result of risk management. So this is a complex, messy situation of risk management. And my interest is how we connect between the experts and the so-called non-experts. And I hope that there'll be quite a lot of overlap with what Nicola has been talking about. So one thing that I'd like to emphasize, I guess, is that we talk about disaster cycles, and it's kind of gone out of fashion now, the idea that it goes back to where it started. But there's certainly a notion of cyclicity of these repeating disasters. And I think an important point is that communication is different in different parts of the communication cycle. So we've already heard a little bit of that really coming through from the COVID example. I draw your attention to the response phase in red in that graph. That is the actual event, the crisis event. So I deal mainly with earthquakes and things like that. So it's very, very short-lived. And that is a period where communication really needs to be left to the emergency management experts. And actually, there's a real question about what the role of general scientists should play in that particular time period. It's often a time when the media are really interested in scientists, and scientists come out of the woodwork to comment. But really, that is a period where what we need is what's called actionable risk messaging, very clear instructions of what people should do in that times of crisis. I've never had to deal with that. It's not an area that I work on. And so I'm really going to be focusing on other parts of the cycle. And that's partly because I think actually a lot of the risk management will actually be in reducing the risk itself, and that's mitigation and preparedness in the lead up to the events. And in that case, the strategies for communication are very, very different from what they are in the emergency response phase. And that is a place where I think The risk experts and the hazard scientists can really get involved in a whole bunch of ways, and I'll talk about some of those. Another interesting one is the post-event period, which is a time that we actually, as scientists, as communicators, we often don't do much about. But actually, I think there's a whole lot of information that can be gathered, the narratives, the stories from people about what's happened and how things worked, how things didn't work. And the stories of the actual people who experienced the event. These kind of narratives can get fed back into the mitigation and preparedness phase. So I'm really saying the white, yellow, and orange areas of the disaster risk cycle are what I'm particularly interested in. So one of the things that I think is important, and Nicola's touched on this, is that we really need to understand the way that people make decisions. There's a 30, 40-year body of empirical evidence that happens to be from social sciences about how people make decisions, the work of Paul Slovic and his group and various people afterwards. And what we know is that people make decisions, particularly in disasters, in a time poor, so not much time, too much information, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of fear and emotion. And that came really strongly through in Nicola's talk. But what we understand from the cognitive understanding of decision processing is that when people are faced with lots of complex information, what they tend to do is they make the decisions based on their values and beliefs. This is the idea of fast and slow thinking. Fast thinking is gut instinct. What do I feel about this? It's predicated by how I feel about the world. And the second phase, then, people know they've made a quick decision. They then search out for information that's going to essentially confirm their gut instinct, their short-term fast thought. And in doing so, will reject any information that counters that, because that actually forces them to reject their fundamental values and belief systems. And the shortcut, a cognitive shortcut that often does that, is trust in individuals. So people trust those who mirror their own values, which means that often that is not the technical experts. That is friends, that's families, that is media influencers, whoever it is, people who are acknowledged as not knowing about the technical information, but they're trusted by the individual. And then finally, and I think perhaps most importantly for us, opinions that aren't formed by logical facts, in other words, it's formed by this gut instinct, aren't necessarily influenced by logical or factual arguments. And that is something that scientists tend to forget, because we are based our whole ethos, our whole approach around logical factual arguments. And the expectation is that when the public say we need information, that what they want is logical factual arguments. And that's not necessarily the case. And that's something that we need to really address. And that image in the bottom right just highlights the fact that these individual heuristics, these individual information processing mechanisms operate in a much wider social realm of the environments that surround us. So decision making is hugely complicated. And the other thing then that makes is that the public, the audience, is hugely complicated. In the top left, we have this is the famous kind of 6 Americas based on the American population, how they feel about climate change. We see on the bottom, the kind of far left, the alarmed group, which is the biggest one, and then we see the different categories down to into the category about 10% kind of more or less rejecting it. And what that tells us is that those 6 different groups reflect 6 very different demographics, different types of people, and they require at least 6 different types of messaging around, in this case, climate change. So when we are in a disaster risk focus, and here again I go back to Istanbul, we need to think about who it is we're actually trying to reach. And we often are very lazy about this. We talk about the public or the community as if it's an amorphous, homogeneous group of people, but they're not. And marketers have understood this for many years. Journalists understand this, communicators of all types understand this, but typically scientists send out very bland, generic messages and then are concerned about why they don't target individual people. So if we are trying to reach the public's a very diverse set of people, and often it's much more effective, as shown in the bottom right, to be in the community targeting individuals. The man on the right is a Mukhtar, he's a local community representative who knows the people in his community, and those kind of individual information gatekeepers are really important. So rather than targeting the public, it may well be that targeting specific groups of individuals, like in the case of Istanbul, Muhtars, is far more effective. But that requires you in having a strategy. And this is a really important point to make, which is really that, that communication is a process, it's not a product. And too often in project, we see communication has been the bolt-on end effect. We've got all the science, now let's communicate this, as if it's just a set of information that can just get sent along the line. We need to start seeing communication as part of the long-term purpose of our disaster risk strategies. And that requires it to reach out to people, to engage them, and then to motivate them to create change. So I just use, again, a personal example from my work in the bottom left, far left, been involved in popular documentaries, BBC Science about, for example, the seismic threat to Istanbul. But I've also made YouTube videos talking about the earthquake process, earthquake science. But increasingly, in more recent years, the images in Istanbul, the person with the microphone there is my PhD student. That's Johanna. She's a visual anthropologist working with social scientists and anthropologists to try to understand how, for example, film might connect with people. And what you see on the right is a film that Johanna made with some of the scientists in a project that we ran a few years ago, geoscientists, that really targeted a young audience with an animated film around earthquake risk in both English and in Turkish. So we shouldn't just see these things as one-offs. We need to see them as a long-going process. And more recently, what I've got interested in, kind of following in from that, from this intelligence really about what people are worried about, is using virtual reality and computer games by taking the earthquake physics that's happening that we can record and actually implementing that into the game physics of gaming engines, so that you can sit in an apartment, a typical apartment. This happens to be modeled on an Istanbul apartment, and you can actually stand in there and experience essentially a realistic representation of the earthquake. And you can modify that with the strength properties of the actual building materials, with the furniture materials, and because it's all represented in the game physics. So I think there's a huge potential here for these immersive environments to actually put people into the situation of earthquakes without having to have them experience in the first place, because one of the things we know is that people who have experienced events are very different communicators to ones who just have heard about them. So what that really leads to is that we need to start having risk dialogues, risk conversations. And I just highlight the statement here that if you're not actively providing information through trusted sources, then more or less someone else is going to be doing that for you, and you may not like what they say. So you should be taking an active part to go into the communities where you think you're having an impact and start to doing that. And this highlights something very much on the back of what Nicola said, which is that we actually know what it is that ordinary people, the public, get upset about in the way that they think about risk. They think about it in a very different way to the way that the specialist does. And I take the work here of Peter Sandman, one of Paul Slovik's students, who basically talks about outrage in terms of community. And he has this, so we think of risk as being hazard multiplied by vulnerability. But he redefines that as hazard multiplied by outrage. In other words, the outrage component is how angry people are about the hazard that they're talking about. And the point that I just want to emphasize here is that we often can't do very much about the hazard. It's sometimes very difficult, given uncertainty, etc., to actually reduce the hazard. But in terms of communication, we can usually do quite a lot about reducing the outrage, the risk that people ultimately feel. And so these sliding scales really are just indicative, but what they basically say is that there's these dimensions to what people consider as making them angry about risks. We've heard some of them, whether they're knowable or controllable, the idea of voluntariness that Nicola talked about, whether they're catastrophic, which tends to stay in the mind, etc., etc. Now, many of those are difficult for individual scientists to adjust to. But actually, the ones on the right, the far right, are a little bit more. Responsiveness. How responsive are the experts to views of the general public? How trusted or untrusted are the experts? The notion about the morality of the particular events or how fair it is really important too, and we can help shape that. So the overall message is shown in the bottom left there. Trust, equity, and a sense of control or efficacy are the issues that underlie most risk controversy. So we spend a lot of time talking about the technical work, trying to get across this information, this factual information, where actually some of the more important messages from a scientific perspective, the scientific experts, is our role as trustworthy, fair, and responsive individuals. So I'd like to just then go on to the second part, really, which is how we do that. And in this, again, go back to Sendai, which talks about this people-centered approach. Now, if you look behind the smaller image, talks about the previous approach, top-down approach. And that one, scientific advisors advised the local authorities, and the local authorities talked to the public, talked to the community. And there was a very loose connection between scientists and the public, maybe on the media, etc. The people-centered approach, you can see, shows these interactions back and forth between scientific advisors and local authorities on one hand, and also scientific advisors and the public on the other hand, as well as the local authorities and the public. Now, if every arrow is a level of difficulty, you can immediately see that the people-centered approach is much harder than the old top-down approach. So we have a real challenge about how do we do that? How do we train? How do we help the experts work with ordinary people? And the images on the right are taken again from the top one, the Tomorrow Cities project, and the bottom one is an EU project we ran a few years ago, where we took a whole bunch of PhD students into effectively the neighborhoods of Istanbul, met with local people, who told them that in this case, earthquakes were not amazing, fantastic things that they associate with, because that's how scientists and geoscientists in particular think of them. Earthquakes are horrible things that kill people and need to be looked at. And these different perspectives are really quite important. So we have to step back a little bit and think about the way that we approach science at the moment. And this is a plot really of scientific production process. So on the vertical axis, we see what is the motivation for the expert. Bottom side, the lower part is it driven purely by a pursuit of knowledge, curiosity-driven science, discovery-led science, or at the top, is it driven by answering some clear problems for society, applied science? And then along the base, along the horizontal, we see to what extent are the end user, in our case, the community or the public, actually involved. Now, for decades, longer than that, centuries, scientists have generally operated in that mode 1 phase, whereby it's about understanding the physical, understanding the world, and not really having any input in from the public. And that's led to the ideas of publications, research papers being the main means by which we measure our impact, research funding, conferences, etc. But increasingly, and particularly through things like Sendai and the SDGs and Paris Climate Agreement, moving into an acceptance of what's referred to as mode 2 science, whereby the end user is increasingly driving the process of what scientists should look at. But then there's a space right far out to the top right, which is where actually it's driven by the public. What is it the public wants? And that's referred to as post-normal science, so the idea that we live with these wicked, complex problems that are never going to be solved by individual scientists. We need to look at them around, and stakeholders, end users, need to be part of that process. So it's a case of really moving our mindset, academic mindset or scientific mindset, from publications to public actions. Now, what I've done here is I've superimposed the science communication modes onto this. So what we can see is mode 1, the science communication mode that fits that, is essentially about public understanding, educating the public about science, informing them and entertaining them to some extent about scientific information. or scientific phenomena. In the second phase, we have public engagement, which is just connecting with the public, where we're actually trying to influence or persuade them about particular things. We're trying to have behavioural change, for example, around earthquake preparedness. And then as we move into the public actions phase, or the field really, then it's a different process. It's about sharing power and responsibility for action with those communities, and even to the extent of handing over to them our science so that they can evolve much more effective alternatives for themselves. So this is a very different way to envisage the way of the scientific process. Now I'm going to look at it in, I can go into this more detail if people are interested, but through three predominant marketing paradigms. So marketing and advertising, they've known all of this stuff for many years, and the approach of public understanding is basically equivalent to their view of make and sell, where they sell a product, and the selling of that product uses all of the connections and all of the skill sets and devices of essentially journalism and the media. And we've had a lot of that from Nicola. The next marketing paradigm is marketing proper, where you're really trying to understand your audience. Your audience is king. Change your product for your audience. It's referred to as sense and respond, because you want to sense what your audience needs and respond to that need. And that really delves into all of the science that comes from the social and behavioral sciences. And then finally, really that public actions space is what is emerging now is called guide and co-create marketing, with companies that are trying to show social value, to say we're not just in this for the money, we've got a long-term vision, we actually want to make a better world, and we happen to make ice cream if it's Ben & Jerry's, or outdoor clothes if it's Patagonia, but basically we're a nice company, we have good social value, trust us. And that's been much more participatory and community-based. So the point that I want to make in the next three slides really is that these are very, very different modes of communication. So if you look at make and sell, the basic assumption here is that the people aren't taking the right decisions because they don't have the right information. Therefore, if science communication is done better, people are going to make better choices. It's referred to as the deficit model thinking. So the goals of science communication is to talk about science, to sell science, to talk about how amazing it is as a way of seeing the world. It's got certain benefits that I'll leave for a minute, but the skill sets that it involves are basically media and journalistic skill sets. It's about speaking without scientific jargon, storytelling and narrative, the importance of imagery. It's about basic media literacy, understanding how the media works and being able to inform it. Media training for experts by press teams and the like, and creating your own creative content, for example, putting stuff out onto YouTube. And so the interactions that those experts will have from the geoscience will be their own media intermediaries, for example, press teams and media centers within their organizations, journalists like Nicola to develop connections and relations with journalists, and then also with their kind of policy advisors and maybe trade organizations, so scientific organizations. But if you contrast that with phase two, sense and respond, it's about knowing who you're trying to reach. And it basically follows this understanding from social science that information is not the thing that actually makes people make decisions. It's people taking account of their values, their beliefs, their internal way of seeing the world. And there's a science to that. There's an empirical science to effective science communication. So the goals here now are about influencing behavioral change. We want people to start thinking about how they can change their house to make it more earthquake proof. We're trying to deliberately move them into a different kind of way of thinking. But it's also about social license, making sure that the community understands and appreciates the work that's getting done, and about engaging with different groups. And again, if I drop to the skills one, what we see there is that it's the skills around the social cognitive understanding, about how we use emotion, motivated reasonings, the idea of cognitive dissonance, etc. It's also about using the skill sets of marketing and the media to segment audiences into different groups that we can target more specifically. It's about the importance of social networks. And fundamentally, it's interdisciplinary working, because if you look at your interactions, You see that now the geoscientist is working with the creative arts and the media, excuse me, they're working with the social sciences, and they're working with the humanities, particularly in ethical dimensions, perhaps with the work that's getting done. But now if you move into the phase 3, the guide and co-create mode, what we see there is a twofold thing, that we need to set out a motivating vision for the work that we do, that we're going to have a better, this science is going to create a better world. But we're also very cognizant that we have to co-create that journey, that path with the people that we're actually involving. And that also comes with a real focus on us as communicators. What is our intent? What is our personal purpose in the communications that we do? So you see there the goals really about building and sustaining trust among stakeholders. It's a much more pluralized, diversified knowledge base. We're trying to bring in local knowledge and respect it in the same way. So Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge. And then we're also trying to empower those communities to develop their own strategies and solutions independent of us. So the skill set, excuse me, the skill sets, very, very different. Again, empathy, listening, authentic listening, not instrumentalized listening when you set up something just to pretend you're listening so you can get information across. Dialogues. It's also about how you negotiate and facilitate meetings between very diverse groups, which means a lot of conciliation skills, a lot of stuff around ethical self-reflection. Why am I doing the work that I'm doing? Is it the right thing? And really thinking about theories of change and monitoring and evaluation what we do to be more effective. And in the bottom right then, the interactions that we have as experts are interesting, because it's got an ethical implication for us. As a communicator, am I a facilitator? Do I just want to help people understand the science that's there and they can make their own decisions? Or am I a catalyst? Do I actually have a view on what the actual outcome should be? So I help work it through, and I come upon a particular line that I think the people should take on catalyzing their actions. And then perhaps absolutely most controversially, am I an activist? Am I actually going to immerse myself in that community and actually actively help them transform themselves and create change? And for many people, the role of the scientist becoming the activist is something that's very problematic. And yet within climate change and within biodiversity, etc., a lot of scientists are finding themselves exactly in that position. So really, I just want to leave you then with this model, whereby I think it's a journey. It's most of us, and me, myself particularly, start off in that make and sell place where we want to be a better communicator. That's what we're trying to do. And that is understanding the media and etc. much more effectively. But then at some stage, I think to be that better communicator is a realization that we will be a better communicator if we can understand that communication science and that the way the audiences process information and respond to that. But then ultimately, as we've seen from Sendai, etc., the end game is to work with those people who are going to be affected. And that requires a guide and co-create mentality, and that's interdisciplinary, participatory, and reflexive. And it's very different, as I say, skill sets from what we started with. So I just want to finish there, excuse me, and talk about, I see these as 3 separate but evolving sections, whereby essentially what we are doing is around training courses, training courses around science communication for experts, but then also encouraging facilitation with the social sciences and to promote sense and respond. And then finally, embedding ourselves in the very communities that we're talking about in order to facilitate, guide and co-create. And so on that point, I will thank you very much. Thank you.